Paulus was captured on the 31st of January 1943 when his southern pocket collapsed. Strecker's northern pocket continued to resist at Stalingrad, although was on the brink too, at a time when the Axis were fighting desperately to shore up the Eastern Front. They had just fallen back from the Caucasus, and a conference was called on the 1st of February 1943 for Hitler and the German High Command to discuss the situation. If it had been done like that, as the good Manstein wanted, they would not have been able to withdraw, and everything would have fallen to pieces. If I had given in to Manstein, they would not have returned. He wouldn't have had a Panzer Army, nor would he have brought a 17th Army back. Everything would have collapsed. In Manstein's memoirs, he paints Hitler as a madman who just wouldn't listen to him, whereas Hitler at the time was saying, we couldn't do what Manstein wants because we would have lost everything. So this shows you that it's not as one-sided as Manstein made it out to be. Decisions had to be made, and sometimes you have to pick the best out of two bad choices, which Hitler from 1942 onwards was forced to do on a frequent basis. Apart from the Manstein issue, the beginning of this conference is all about shoring up the front, moving units from here to there, and discussing some material issues. I won't bore you with that, but then suddenly halfway through this discussion, a totally different conversation starts when Hitler just comes out with this. True to form, they surrendered themselves, because otherwise you gather yourselves together, build an all-round defence, and bullet yourself with the last cartridge. He's referring to Paulus and the 6th Army Command here, and I'm having to censor myself because of YouTube. If you imagine that a woman, after being insulted a few times, has so much pride that she goes out, locks herself in, and arrows herself dead immediately, then I have no respect for a soldier who shrinks back from it and prefers going into captivity. Hitler actually brings this up again later in the conference, so I'm jumping ahead here, but it's the same point. A beautiful woman, who really was a first-rate beauty, is insulted with a single word. She says afterward, because of some trifle, "Then I can go, I am superfluous." Then go. Afterward, the woman leaves, writes farewell letters, and censors herself. According to the source, Hitler is probably referring to a secretary of Hermann Goering, who, after Goering accused her of something bad, it's not stated what, she took action against herself. Apparently, she later received a state funeral for her heroic attitude, suggesting that self-annihilation is heroic in the eyes of the National Socialists. But Hitler's comments when he first mentions this could also potentially be referring to his half-niece Geli Rubal, whom it was rumoured he was having intimate relations with. In the 1920s, he took Geli everywhere, to the cinema, on picnics, and shopping for clothes. And when Hitler's chauffeur Emil Maurice told Hitler that he was having an affair with Geli, Hitler not only forced him to stop their relationship, but also dismissed Maurice as Hitler's personal bodyguard. Hitler's jealous possessiveness took on pathological proportions. If she went out without him, Geli was chaperoned and had to be home early. Everything she did was monitored and controlled. She was effectively a prisoner. She resented it bitterly. "My uncle is a monster," she is reported as saying. "No one can imagine what he demands of me." Well, there's a bunch of different accounts of what exactly happened, but it appears that Geli Rubal turned Hitler's own pistol on herself and was found dead on the morning of the 19th of September 1931. Hearing of this, Hitler rushed back and was stopped by the police for speeding. His reaction was desperate and he wanted to give up politics entirely, and he may have had a breakdown. So I don't know if he was originally referring to Geli Rubal or just to Goering's secretary, but nonetheless, Hitler has known a few women who were willing to make the ultimate self-sacrifice, either for himself or for others. Obviously, Eva Braun would also do so after marrying him, so I guess he knows what he's talking about when it comes to women eating lead. I can't understand it either. I still think that it might not be true, that he, Paulus, may be seriously wounded. No, it is true. The Russians will now, immediately, they will go to Moscow immediately to the GRU, and they will give out orders that the northern pocket should surrender as well. This Schmidt will sign everything. Arthur Schmidt was the Sixth Army's Chief of Staff, and actually didn't cooperate with the Soviets at all, although Hitler wasn't to know this at the time. But Hitler's point is interesting because, to his Soviet captors, Paulus claimed that he had no authority over Strecker's northern pocket, saying that Hitler commanded both pockets separately after the Sixth Army had been split in two. Thus, for this and other reasons, Paulus claimed he couldn't order Strecker to surrender. Since my troops were split into two groups, I was the commander of the other pocket only in theory. Orders came separately from Führer headquarters, and each group was commanded by a different general. Well, Hitler clearly thinks that he does have authority over the northern pocket, and was worried that Paulus would order Strecker to surrender, showing further proof that Paulus was bluffing to his Soviet captors, something that would be relevant for episode 50 of the Stalingrad series. But, continuing, a person who doesn't have the courage at such a moment to take the step that everyone has to take once won't have the strength to resist. He'll develop a martyr complex. With us, the intellect is cultivated too much, and strength of character not enough. Hitler's just hinted at the ideology here. The intellect is cultivated too much, and the strength of character not enough. But we'll come back to that. The discussion then moves on to talk about whether Paulus, Schmidt and Seydlitz, one of the corps commanders, were of decent character or not, and whether Huber should have stayed in the pocket or not, and whether it would have helped the situation if he had. Hitler then remarks, "In peacetime, 18,000 to 20,000 people chose self-sacrifice each year in the German Reich without being in any such situation. Here a man can see how 50,000 to 60,000 of his soldiers die and defend themselves bravely to the end. How can he then surrender to the Bolsheviks?" It's something that we really can't understand at all. For a madman, Hitler's memory is surprisingly good. The statistics show that, yeah, between 18,000 and 22,000 people chose Plato's World of Forms over reality during the years 1930 and 1938. It's notable that the numbers went up from 1935 onwards. You'd think that if Hitler had this supposed economic miracle, the numbers would go down, not up. And yet, here we see a sharp increase in the amount of Aufheben in Germany after Hitler really starts implementing his economic policies. This obviously casts doubt on several narratives floating about out there. But the first doubt had already risen earlier. That was the moment when it was said that he, Paulus, asked what he should do now. How can he even ask such a thing? So, in the future, whenever a fortification is besieged and the commanding officer receives a demand to surrender, he's going to ask first, "What shall I do now?" Skipping ahead slightly, how easy is it to do such a thing? The pistol. That's quite easy. What kind of cowardice it must be to flinch even from that? Ha! Better let yourself be buried alive. And in such a situation where he knows full well that his death is the requirement for holding the next pocket. Because if he gives an example like that, you can't expect men to continue fighting. There's no excuse. Then he has to YouTube himself before if the nerves threaten to fail. If the nerves fail, there is nothing left but to say, "I can't take it any longer," and tax oneself. There you can also say the man has to centrally plan himself, just like in earlier times the generals threw themselves onto their swords when they saw that all was lost. That's a matter of course. Even Varus ordered to the slaves, "Kill me now." Varus was the ancient Roman general who lost 3 legions when they were ambushed by Germanic tribes in the Teutoburg forest. Realizing that all hope is lost, he fell upon his sword. But we have to remember that this was in an age of torture pits, slavery and other horrendous acts. Some of the captured Romans were set alight, others were only rescued 40 years after they were captured. So it does make sense why Varus would choose this option over, no doubt, a worse fate. Paulus, though, wasn't facing an outcome like that. I'll give more explanation in the final episode of the Stalingrad series, but Paulus' troops were dying mainly because of the Stalingrad airlift and typhus more so than by deliberate Soviet vengeance. So, knowing that there's a good chance that he would survive Soviet captivity, Paulus does not have the same concern as Varus, making this comparison between the two null and void. I still think that they might have done it, and that the Russians only claim they all gave themselves over into captivity. No. The peculiar thing is, if I may say it, that they didn't announce that Paulus was captured seriously wounded. Then they could say tomorrow he died of his wounds. As you can see, they're not entirely convinced that Paulus had been captured. And I mean, they're relying entirely on Soviet sources of information here, which is obviously not ideal. However, despite all the hope, the evidence that they had and the logic that Gerhard Engel was presenting suggested that Paulus was actually in Soviet hands. So after a bit more discussion, Hitler then says, "During this war, no one else will become a field marshal. That will all be done after the end of the war. One should not count one's chickens before they hatch." We were so strongly convinced about the end that our last joy, we had to assume it would end heroically. One couldn't imagine anything else. Well, let's just put this into context. The reason why they were hoping that Paulus would end himself heroically was because, up till this point, Germany was not on a total war footing. Due to the stab-in-the-back myth and his ideas surrounding central planning, Hitler had been reluctant to burden the German people too much in case they rebelled against him. And so far in the war, they hadn't really needed to go all in and throw every resource at the effort. The West had folded so easily, the Red Army had crumbled in 1941, and even in 1942 it looked like the Soviets were on the brink. It was only after the Soviet counterattacks from mid-1942 onwards that it was realised that the Soviet Union was not actually out for the count, and that it was, in fact, the Axis who were on the back foot. So things had changed. Hitler and Goebbels now needed to put Germany on a total war footing, and that meant burdening the German people. To soften this blow, the German folk needed a heroic inspiration, and that inspiration was supposed to have been Stalingrad. It had been expected that Paulus would go out in a blaze of glory, fighting to the last, before falling upon his Luger. That didn't happen, and now they were upset, because this undermined the entire message that they were trying to create. Paulus's capture suggested that this wasn't the life and death struggle that Hitler was painting it as. It suggested that the Germans didn't need to fight to the last for Hitler, and that surrender was actually an option. Hitler, unhappy with this logic, was therefore vowing not to create another field marshal in the war, which is sort of an admittance that he had made a mistake when he made Paulus a field marshal. And in this human environment, how can one act differently? There I must say that every soldier is an idiot who risks his life and risks his life again and again. If a little cat is overwhelmed, I can still understand that. The troop commander has it much easier. Everyone looks at him. For him, it's simple to film himself. It's difficult for the ordinary man. If the little worm, on which everything is falling, says in such a situation and lets himself be captured, then I can understand that. After some more incoherent sentences and a brief question over whether the news had gone out, Hitler continues. "It hurts me so much because the heroism of so many soldiers is destroyed by a single spineless weakling, and the man is going to do that now. You have to imagine it. He comes to Moscow and just imagine the rat cage. He'll sign everything there. He will make confessions and appeals. You'll see. They'll walk down the road completely disregarding any principle to the deepest abyss. In this case, one can also say, an evil deed generates new evil again and again." That's right, Hitler doesn't see himself as evil. But he is mainly concerned about his public image. It's not necessarily about Paulus as such, but more what Paulus might say while he's in Soviet captivity. If Paulus starts talking about Hitler being a madman and how Germany is doing bad things behind the scenes, it could be a major blow to Hitler's reputation and the image of the Reich that Hitler is trying to maintain. And this is how politicians think. It's about what makes us look good in the public eye, not what is actually good for the people involved. They promise you the world and deliver you into poverty. After a bit more discussion, he says, "If somebody knows something we don't know about, it can't be determined exactly. But with soldiers, the primary thing is always the matter of principle, and if we can't cultivate that, if we breed only pure intellectual acrobats and intellectual athletes, mental athletes, then we will never get that species which alone can stand the heavy blows of fate. That's decisive." Zeitzler then agrees with him and gives him an example of him promoting a young officer to the general's staff, even though that officer had barely had 8 weeks of training. What mattered was his actions in the field, not his knowledge. And this comes down to Hitler's ideology and philosophy. He wants men who will take unthinking action. He doesn't want people who will think, he wants people who will obey. And while military historians like Robert Citino talk about the motivations of the German officers and soldiers in their books, they're often left scratching their heads as to why. They were men of will and determination who considered retreat a personal insult, and were willing to fight to the last German soldier in a hopeless war. Yeah, that's what they did, that's how they acted, but it doesn't answer why. Personal insult was not the reason they kept fighting. They were taught by 2 millennia of philosophers not to think, not to be selfish, but to sacrifice everything, including their lives, for the group, the Volk. The Nazis preached a certain philosophy, and they carried it out in action. They preached authority above rights, the group above the individual, sacrifice above happiness, nihilism above morality, feelings above facts, pliability above absolutes, obedience above logic, the Führer above the self, and they applied it. The Nazis did not want man to exist. They wanted men as robots, men without thought, purpose, passion, or self. The German generals were not meant to think, just obey. And this is really hard to convey in words, but if you can imagine yourself in a world which is collapsing around you, a world of broken promises and lying propaganda, a world which you now despise, preferring the comforting thought of an afterlife over mere material concerns. Having rejected reality, your emotions may now not know what to believe, and what not to believe. And so, in this scenario where you can't even trust your own senses, your thinking brain is shut down, leaving you with only 2 options: insanity or authority. The leader is smart, the leader has all the answers, he knows more than you do, therefore don't worry about all the questions you have, don't concern yourself with logic and contradictions, just obey the leader, and he will lead you to the promised land. This is the leader principle, the Führerprinzip, as it was called in German, and it's built upon German philosophy, which goes through Hegel and Kant and also all the way back to the ancient Greeks. And I've talked about this in previous videos, and I need to do more videos on it, but this is why Hitler is in the process of choosing generals that will stand fast, not think. It's also why he thinks he can order Paulus to die at the Volga. Paulus shouldn't even question it. And he's saying that if his nerves get in the way, you've just got to take action, bro. And people hate it when I bring up ideology, but this whole principle of unthinking self-sacrifice, not hesitating to end yourself for the glory of the leader and the people, it's on full show here in the middle of the war. Yes, we have to take bold, courageous people who are also prepared to risk their lives, just like every soldier risks his life. What does that mean, life? Life, people. The individual indeed has to die. What remains alive beyond the individual is the people. But how can one fear this moment, through which he can free himself from misery, if duty doesn't hold him back in this valley of suffering? Again, this goes into the whole idea of life as suffering, life as a bitter struggle, mein Kampf. There's the law of struggle, Kampfgesetz. So it's all tied together. After this, Hitler and Zeitzler discuss whether Paulus had surrendered or had just been captured. Hitler says that he wants Karl Strecker and the Northern Pocket to hold out as long as possible, probably to salvage the political situation. And it was all in vain though, because Strecker's pocket would collapse early the next morning. Then Hitler says even the Romanian general Lascar fell with his men, and he was glad that he gave Lascar a medal. And in case you haven't watched the Stalingrad series, Lascar had been surrounded in a pocket during Operation Uranus, when the Soviets smashed through the Romanian Third Army on the Don, and he had surrendered. Hitler, though, doesn't realise that Lascar had surrendered, and so he's praising the Romanian General Lascar for having the courage to die with his troops when he actually didn't die. They talk a bit more about whether the other generals in the pocket were wounded or not, or whether they had been overpowered and had surrendered. And to this, Hitler says, "We have to say that it wasn't a capitulation, but an overpowering. They hadn't received any supplies for months, and that therefore the Russians succeeded in overwhelming some of them." Again, it's all about fighting to the end and no surrender. Now, Zeitzler was the chief of the General Staff of the German Army High Command, the OKH, and his duty was mainly to deal with the Eastern Front. The Western Front was mainly the concern of the OKW, and so the conference with Zeitzler now ends, and the conference with the OKW now begins. Keitel and Jodl now enter the picture, along with Jesenek of the Luftwaffe, and they discuss the situation in North Africa with Rommel and the American landings, and it's not really that relevant, so we'll skip these discussions. But again, they end up talking about the situation at Stalingrad, and Hitler is repeating this point over and over, obsessing about Paulus not taking his own life. And this seems to matter more than anything else. The number of tanks in North Africa, how badly the Luftwaffe was doing, how many submarines they were dealing with in the Mediterranean. At this moment, none of this matters as much as the fate of Paulus. And again, the women eating the barrels of guns and the ideology come up as well. I don't understand a man like Paulus who doesn't prefer death. The heroism of so many tens of thousands of men, officers and generals is wiped out by a man like that, who, when the moment comes, doesn't possess the character to do what a weak woman has done. Doubting that Paulus had let himself be captured, Jodl said, "But I'm still not quite sure if that's right. The man and the woman were together there. Later the man died of his illness. Then I received a letter from that woman. She begged me to care for the children. It wasn't possible for her to continue living despite her children. Then she funeraled herself. The woman did that. She found the strength. And soldiers don't find the strength? You see, it won't take 8 days before Seydlitz and Schmidt and also Paulus speak on the radio." This is a bit different, and I'm not sure who he's referring to here. It's clearly not Geli Rebal or Goering's secretary. So if anyone knows which woman he's talking about, please let me know below. However, raising the same points over and over again really rams home just how upset Hitler was over this situation. "Personally, it hurts me the most that I still did that. Promoted him to Field Marshal. I wanted to give him the last happiness. That's the last Field Marshal I will make during the war. One should not praise the day until it's over. I don't understand that at all. If you see so many men die, I really must say how easy it was for our... He didn't consider anything. That is completely ridiculous. So many men have to die, and then a man like that goes out and besmirches the heroism of so many others at the last minute. He could have delivered himself from every misery, and reached eternity, and entered into the national immortality, but he preferred going to Moscow. How can there even be a choice? It's just crazy." The conversation continues a bit more, and they keep bringing up many of the same points we've already mentioned. They then turn to the air war and some production figures, and then the conference comes to an end. I won't go over all that here because we've hit on all the important points. However, I will bring up a quote from earlier that I said we'd come back to. "With us, the intellect is cultivated too much, and strength of character not enough." The intellect, the thinking part of the brain, is cultivated too much. We have too much thinking and not enough strength of character or willpower. This is classic German philosophy of the likes of Hegel and Kant, as well as many others. We don't want people using logic, we don't want people using their brains or rationality. We want unthinking, irrational, obedient slaves. This idea is at the heart of the ideology, and Hitler's bringing it up in the centre of the war. And at least he is consistent in this regard, as were some of the other generals. What is left for a defeated general? In ancient times they took poison. A field marshal does not become a prisoner. Such a thing is just not possible. Of course it's possible. Paulus has just done it. So why can't you? Why is Model not thinking? Why is he just obeying the Führer? Well, it's because this philosophy had conditioned them to unthink. That's why. And to understand this philosophy, I've done videos on it, but I would also encourage you to read the book The Cause of Hitler's Germany by Peikoff, if you haven't done so already. One final thing that we'll discuss is this. So Paulus, or his chief of staff Arthur Schmidt, had issued 364 death sentences to the soldiers of the 6th Army in the final days of the battle. Both Paulus and Schmidt then, of course, ended up in Soviet hands. They had been willing to punish others with death, but weren't willing to hold themselves to the same standard. And this begs the question, is it right for the higher ranks to demand that their subordinates fight on and not surrender? Is it right for a soldier to obey all orders, even those that call for him to take his own life? Even now, you will get people arguing that men should just blindly follow orders or just sacrifice themselves for other people, most of whom they've never met, and most of whom don't care about you one bit. They think there's some higher ideal, a nation or a society or a paradise, that the individual must forfeit their lives towards. And Hitler embodies this ideal completely. He would ultimately offer his own life in his bunker in 1945, and that's his choice, but should he or anyone else be able to demand that same sacrifice of others? Or are we free to make our own decisions? A lot of people argue that it is our duty to obey all commands from above, regardless of their nature. Others think that there's a limit. We should only obey orders up until we're ordered to commit crimes or self-deletion, but that it's perfectly fine to follow the orders telling us to report to the barracks, dress up in a uniform, grab a weapon and self-sacrifice ourselves for some land that's not ours. And then there's a small minority who would say that we should be free to make our own decisions in all instances. But of course, they are the most insane. Or so I'm told consistently. And I would like to hear where you stand on this issue. So comment below and let me know, because maybe I'll do a follow-up video discussing your responses. And if you haven't seen the video I did on the conference in December 1942, I'll link to it everywhere. Manstein was up for debate again, and Hitler decided that Paulus should fight on. There's also a discussion about Hitler's racism in there, so it's a really interesting conference. I'll leave it there. Thanks for watching, bye for now.